Hey friends, today's episode is brought to you by Factor. Factor is a meal kit delivery service that specializes in satisfying the specific dietary needs of their customers. They offer over 34 different keto, vegan, calorie smart, and protein plus meals each week, all of which are selected and prepared by Factor's dedicated team of expert chefs. You can also pick up a few healthy snacks, as Factor offers an assortment of over 35 chips, smoothies, and juices, and much more. They even sell stuff that you can cook with your store-bought items, such as the smoked pork and bison jalapeno cheddar bratwurst, which made me hungry just writing that. Now, to get your hands on all of Factor's delicious, nutritious goodies, just click the link in the description or head over to factor75.com and use the code LetsRead50 for half off your order price. Now, personally, I try my best to stick to a balanced and nutritious diet, but the rising costs are making that harder and harder as time goes on, and having a Factor subscription makes that much easier for me. The Protein Plus options are an absolute godsend when it comes to making gains with my weightlifting, so I really can't recommend Factor enough. So either click the link below or use the code LetsRead50 at factor75.com. I was walking home from the mall on Valentine's Day, feeling pretty good about my day of shopping and indulging in some much-needed me time. The sun was starting to set and the sky was a beautiful shade of pink and orange, so I decided to take the long way home to enjoy the peacefulness of the quiet streets and the beauty of the sky above me. I was 25 and excited to be starting a new job at the coffee shop next to my apartment. I had finally moved out of my parents' house and was beginning to feel like my life was going in the direction I wanted it to. I was listening to music through my earbuds, but had this nerve-wracking feeling that something was just off. It's like I could feel someone watching me. Almost like an invisible set of eyes were just locked directly to my every move. My heart began to race and my breathing became shallow as I quickened my pace, and I was desperate just to get home. I looked over my shoulder and, of course, there he was. My ex. The one who couldn't get over me and just wouldn't leave me alone. After we broke up almost a year before this, he did everything he could to convince me to take him back. At first, it was normal stuff like having flowers sent to my home or mailing me sweet letters in the mail. It was romantic and nice and kind of innocent even, but I didn't want to get back together with him, so I never responded to any of it. At this point, I hadn't seen or heard from him for a couple of months, and I thought that he had finally gotten the hint that it was over between us, but apparently not. He was walking about 10 feet behind me, and when I looked back at him, I could see this sort of sinister look in his eyes. He'd always been a bit creepy, but this was some next-level stuff. He didn't say a word. He just sort of smiled this horribly disturbing smile. I tried to ignore him and keep walking, but he started following me more closely, getting closer and closer with each step. I turned a corner, hoping to lose him, but he was still there, and every step that I took, he took the same one, only 5 feet behind me. I started to feel my panic set in. I'd always felt safe walking home alone, but now I felt like I was being hunted or stalked like someone's prey. I pulled out my phone, calling a friend, but she didn't answer. I tried calling my roommate, but still no answer. I was completely alone with no one to help me. I had called the police on him many times before, and the last time they just straight up told me not to call again about him unless it was a life or death situation, and I really didn't want to hear about that again. So I started to run, hoping to get to my apartment building before he caught up with me. I could hear him getting closer and closer with every step, and so close that I could even hear his heavy breathing. I was gasping for air and my heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew that I had to keep running. I finally made it to my building and ran inside, but he caught the door and followed me in. I could hear his footsteps echoing down the hall as I ran to my apartment and locked the door behind me once I was safely inside. I was okay. I wanted to scream and cry at the same time, but it wasn't over yet. I tried to calm myself down, but my mind was just racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want to make a scene, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I just wanted it all to be over. I wanted my ex to be one of those guys that just moves on when a relationship ends. My roommate found me curled up in a ball in front of the door and asked me what happened. Through tears and hyperventilation, I told her everything. She was horrified and told me that she didn't care what they said the last time that I had called and that she was calling the police, because being chased home by your psycho stalker ex is in fact life or death. Just as she got a hold of the dispatcher, we heard a noise outside the door. I froze, my heart racing. My roommate and I stared at each other with wide eyes, waiting, listening for any noise coming from outside my door. Was he trying to get inside? I grabbed a knife from the kitchen just in case. The noise stopped and I started to relax a little. My roommate was explaining everything to the dispatcher when suddenly it started again. This time it was louder. It was a loud banging noise, but the banging wasn't coming from the door. It was almost like he was stomping around outside the door, having a tantrum that he wasn't able to get inside. I'd never experienced that side of him, and I never knew that he was capable of doing something like this. Throughout our whole relationship, he seemed so normal. The reason we broke up was because he had cheated, and I felt like if he was willing to risk our whole relationship for one night with a random woman, then our relationship didn't mean much to him to begin with. You'd think that he would have been able to move on by the time this all happened. I crept up to the door, knife in hand, and peered through the peephole. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear someone breathing. It sounded like his mouth was pressed against the door like he wanted to hear it. I started to panic again, but my roommate tried her best to calm me down. The police told us to stay inside and keep the door locked until they arrived. They said it would only take around 10 minutes for them to get there. We sat on the floor and waited for the police. All the while, I could hear him still breathing on the other side of the door, and I knew that all he wanted was to get inside and do God knows what to me. Finally, the police got there, and they arrested my ex. He didn't put up a fight and went with them willingly. They took him away, and I was finally able to sort of breathe a sigh of relief, but unfortunately, this sort of fear and panic would stay with me for quite a long time. No matter how much I wanted to or how convenient it would be, I could never get myself to walk home alone again. I never forgot the feeling of being followed and hunted by someone who had supposedly loved me before. I was lucky to make it out alive, but the thought of what could have happened is something I still think about almost every day. I never thought that someone I once loved could turn into a monster. It's important to always trust your instincts. I learned that the hard way, and I hope that my story can serve as a warning to others. It serves as a reminder that sometimes love can just turn into an obsession, and that obsession can turn into something much more dangerous. I was so excited to start a new life in the city. My girlfriend and I had just moved into a small apartment, and I was eager to explore a place that I'd never been before. I had gone to the grocery store to pick up a few things, and as I was walking home, I was texting my girlfriend about all the cool things I came across on the walk and all the fun stuff that there was for us to do together around the city. I was so preoccupied with my phone that I didn't even realize that I'd gotten turned around. I don't know how I was stupid enough to not look where I was going, but I was just really excited to tell her about my day and everything I saw. After a while, I finally looked up and realized that I had no idea where I was. The streets were empty and the buildings appeared to look abandoned with their doors and windows boarded up. It kind of looked like something out of an apocalyptic video game, The Last of Us. I was starting to feel uneasy and honestly a little scared. This looked like nothing of the area that I was just walking in not too long ago. I looked at my phone's map and started making my way back in the right direction. I was around 4 miles from home still, and it was getting dark. As I was walking, I saw an old car with a taxi sign on top. It was starting to rain and the darkness was engulfing the streets around me, but I still hesitated for a second before getting in. It didn't look like an official taxi, and I'd seen way too many true crime shows to trust it, but I just wanted to get home, and the thought of being lost in this unfamiliar place was freaking me out way more than getting in the car. I knocked on the window and the driver rolled it down just a little crack, and it was enough for me to ask if he was able to take me where I needed to go. He didn't speak, just nodded a yes in my direction. He unlocked the doors and I got in and told him to drop me off at the gas station near my apartment building, and I gave him the address. The driver started the engine and we were off. I still had my Maps app open and glanced at it every so often to make sure that we were going in the right direction. Only the further we drove, I noticed that we had started going in the opposite direction of my apartment. I started to get nervous and asked the driver if he could take me home or even just let me out so I could find another ride, but he didn't say a word and instead just kept driving. I started to feel panic set in as the car took me further away from my home. I demanded that the driver let me out, and he just sort of chuckled to himself. I tried to open the door, but it was locked and didn't have a button to unlock it. It was one of those locks where when the car is locked, it retracts into the door and you can't pull it up to unlock it. And I was trapped. I started to feel a cold sweat on my skin as the fear that I was feeling began to fill every inch of my body. The driver drove for what felt like forever, taking me deeper into the outskirts of the city down its darkest, deserted streets. In reality, we probably only drove for around 30 minutes, but the panic and fear that I was feeling in that car made every second feel like hours. The rain was coming down harder and harder, and I could feel the driver's eyes on me through the rearview mirror. He was watching me closely, and it was making me even more afraid. I was trapped in that taxi with a stranger who seemed to have no intention of letting me go. The fear and desperation was overwhelming, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think of a way out. Eventually, the taxi pulled off to the side of the road, and the driver turned to look at me. He was wearing a black hoodie, and his face was littered with the trashiest tattoos I'd ever seen. I almost wanted to laugh for a second and remembered where I was and decided that that wouldn't be the best idea. I could see a sort of creepy smirk on his face as he spoke to me in a harsh voice. "Welcome to your final destination," he said, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I tried to reason with the driver to just let me go and there'd be no harm done, but he wouldn't listen. He just laughed as he got out of the car and walked towards the back door. I didn't even know what to think. I had no idea what he was going to do with me. The driver opened the back door and dragged me out of the car by my jacket. He threw me into the gutter, and I hit the ground hard. I was in pain, but I was still alive. I tried to get up and run, but he was fast and caught me, tackling me to the ground. He put a knife to my throat, and I was on the verge of tears, and I tried to scream, but nothing came out. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking, and the driver just laughed, saying, "Why not?" I was terrified and I couldn't move. I could feel the cold metal of the knife against my skin. Finally, I was able to muster up a scream loud enough that somehow a group of people nearby were able to hear it. I heard footsteps coming from down the street, and thank God that they were getting closer. The man told me to shut up and press the knife harder against my skin. And just when I thought things were over for me, I heard a voice calling out in the distance. "Hey, what's going on here?" I looked down the street, and only about 50 feet away, a group of people were walking towards us. They were watching us, and I realized that the driver was beginning to get nervous. His hands began to shake, and he got off of me as fast as he could. He turned and ran away on foot, just leaving his car and me laying there on the street, reeling from what had just happened. The group ran towards me, and one of the guys helped me up and put pressure on the wound that I didn't even notice that I had on my neck. They called the police, and an ambulance took me to the hospital. I needed a few stitches for the laceration on my throat, but was otherwise physically okay. The police searched the vehicle and realized that it was stolen, and there was nothing in it to tie it to the person who had done that to me that night. Now, years later, another man was abducted in the same manner in that area, only this time, the man was caught and he was arrested. I was called in due to the correlation in the crime and was able to identify the man as the man who attacked me on that night, and thank God that he was charged and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He never admitted to kidnapping anyone else, but we knew that that was probably not true. I tried my best to get over it, but the emotional scars will always be there, along with the physical one on my neck. I'm so grateful to the people who saved me. I'll never forget the fear and desperation that I felt in that taxi, but I'll also never forget the kindness and bravery of the strangers who risked their lives to help me and make sure that I was okay. From that day on, I made sure to always pay attention to my surroundings and never, let my guard down again. It was a beautiful day and I was walking home from the gym. I lived in a quiet neighborhood and never felt unsafe during the day or even at night for that matter. I was kind of just humming to myself, enjoying the warm breeze on my skin when I heard a car revving its engine behind me. It was still around 50 feet away, but something about it was giving me this really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Just as I was about to turn back around and continue on my way, the car sped up and its path wasn't leading down the road. It was leading directly towards me. I started to panic and wonder if I was just being paranoid. Maybe the driver was having some sort of medical emergency and he wasn't able to control the car. Either way, it was heading to hit me directly. I jumped out of the way, barely avoiding being hit by the car, and the car swerved and then continued down the road. I was breathing heavily and my heart was just racing from the shock. The car was long gone by the time I pulled myself together, and I didn't think to memorize the plates, so I just decided against calling the police and counting my blessings. I continued walking down the street, and after getting a few blocks further, I figured that I was in the clear from that psycho that had just tried to end my life. I was grabbing water out of my backpack when I heard the revving of an engine behind me again. I was hoping it wasn't the same guy, but I wasn't that lucky. I glanced behind me, and this time, the guy was driving even faster, and the car was headed straight for me yet again. I had nowhere to run, and I wasn't fast enough anyways, so I drove out of the way and onto the grass of someone's nearby lawn. The car rushed by me, missing me by inches. I was in shock, wondering what in God's name was going on. Was this some kind of twisted joke? Had I done something to make this guy so mad at me that it was worth ending my life? I quickly got up, grabbed my backpack, and started running in the opposite direction. I was running, dialing 911 when I looked back and watched in horror as the car was making a U-turn. I was in a neighborhood, so there were no stores I could take shelter in. I was terrified, dodging cars and jumping over fences in a desperate attempt to escape. I could hear the car getting closer and closer, and I knew that I was running out of options. The 911 operator finally picked up the phone and I told them everything. They advised me to try to find a store that I could wait in until they got there, but it was too late. I gotten distracted from talking to the dispatcher that I had stopped running fast enough and didn't realize that the car had caught up to me. And before I knew it, the car hit me from behind and sent me flying into the air. I hit the pavement hard, my head slamming against the concrete. I didn't pass out, but my vision went blurry and my mind went blank until I eventually was completely out. The last thing I remember was the car driving away and the sound of tires screeching. I don't know how long I was lying there, but eventually someone noticed me and called me for help. I was rushed to the hospital where I was treated for multiple broken bones and internal injuries. I was placed in a medically induced coma for several days, and when I finally woke up, I was told that I was lucky to be alive. That most people who came in with those same injuries weren't so lucky. I spoke to law enforcement and they told me that I was probably involved in a targeted hit and run, just based on the area that I was in. And several months later, after a long road of recovery and finally being told that it was okay to start walking long distances again, I was walking home from work when I saw the same car, or at least that I thought was the same car, driving down the road. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and I immediately started running in the opposite direction. To my utter shock and horror, the car started giving chase again, but this time I was better prepared. I was able to dodge and weave and eventually lost the car. Only after watching the car drive right past me and down another street did I realize that I was imagining it, and that it wasn't even the same car. It was just somebody driving in my direction. I was relieved, but I was also scared. I couldn't understand why someone had tried to kill me. It had been over 7 months, but I thought about it constantly. Was it some kind of vendetta back then? Was it just a random act of violence related to gangs or something? I didn't know, and it was driving me crazy. I became paranoid, always looking over my shoulder and never walking home alone. I was always on guard, always ready to run if I saw the car coming. It was a constant battle in my mind, and I was always exhausted from stress and these terrible dreams. I eventually started to carry pepper spray and a whistle with me, determined to protect myself if the car or the man driving it ever came after me again. And years went by, and I never saw the car again. I started to relax, thinking that maybe the danger was over. I started to walk home during the day, no longer looking over my shoulder. But then one day, I was walking home from work and I saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road. I froze, the memories of being chased and nearly killed flooding back to me. I quickly realized that the car was empty, but the fear still lingered. I called the police, telling them about my experience in the car and the fact that it was sitting right in front of me. They came and they checked it out, but there really was no evidence of foul play, and they told me that it was just a coincidence and that I had nothing to worry about, and because I had no proof, there really was no lead that they could go on. Seeing the car again took me right back to the way I used to feel. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger. I was living in fear, and it was taking a toll on my mental health. This time, I started seeing a therapist to try to work through my fear and anxiety. I talked about the car and my experiences, trying to make sense of it all. My therapist suggested that I confront my fears and try to find closure. So for days, I mustered up the courage and walked around the city looking for the car. I'm now 99% positive that that isn't what my therapist meant when he told me to find closure, but I was kind of an idiot. And after weeks of looking, I found it. I took a deep breath and approached the car, ready to face my fears head on. As I got closer, I noticed that the model of the car was different from the one I remembered, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me, and I realized that this car, again, wasn't the same one that terrorized me all that time ago. Maybe going to confront the guy wasn't the best plan, but realizing that there wasn't anything for me to be scared of anymore gave me this huge sense of relief that I was finally able to live my life normally again. I guess the paranoia still exists, but being able to face my fears, should it ever arrive again, I'll be ready. I lived in Venice, California, and I was walking home from a friend's house late at night. I lived just a few blocks away, but I always felt nervous walking home alone at night. Venice has always been known for its kind of high crime rates and homeless population, and I always made sure to carry my pepper spray with me wherever I went. I had no intentions of becoming a victim in the city like the countless other women that I've heard of before, and everything seemed fine at first. The walk was short, and every now and then I'd pass another person and smile at them. It was late and I was nervous, but I tried my absolute best not to show it. I didn't want to seem vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. I was wearing an old backpack that I'd used in high school instead of carrying my purse to try to deter thieves, and I made sure to put on clothes that didn't show much of my body. There wasn't such a thing as being too careful to me, and as I was walking, I heard a man's raspy sort of smoker's voice behind me. "Excuse me, miss. Got any spare change?" I turned around to see what appeared to be a homeless man. His clothes were torn up with plenty of holes, and his eyes seemed to be wild. It almost seemed like his thoughts were wandering as he was talking. I just shook my head and told him that I didn't have any money and that I was sorry. But he didn't seem to appreciate that. "Come on, just a little bit." He persisted, his voice growing more aggressive. "A pretty girl like you is bound to have at least a few dollars on her." I hated talking to strangers, let alone a person who was apparently as unpredictable as this guy seemed to be. I didn't want to deal with the situation any longer and decided ignoring his statement would be the best option. I didn't want to upset him any further or make things harder on myself by rejecting his request for money again, so I just whispered a quick, "I'm sorry," and started to walk faster away from him, trying to put as much distance between us as I possibly could. The man followed, throwing insults here and there and eventually resorting to making threats. "You rich girls always think you're better than us. You're gonna regret this. I can promise you that." I was scared, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I quickened my pace even more to the point where I was basically running away from the guy, but he was still following me and surprisingly keeping up with me pretty well. I started to hear him getting closer, and I was terrified that he was going to attack me or hurt me. I reached into my pocket and I grabbed my pepper spray, ready just in case. I turned around, I pointed it at the man and yelled as loud as I could, "Leave me alone!" I tried to sound brave, but it just came out as some little squeal. The homeless man just laughed in a way that gave my whole body chills. He took a step closer, and I aimed the pepper spray directly at his face. "Don't come any closer, please. I don't want to hurt you. Just leave me alone and I'll forget this ever happened," I warned, and my voice was shaking. But he didn't seem to listen. He just kept coming, and his eyes were just transfixed on me. I hadn't really used it before, but I squeezed the trigger, and a burst of pepper spray shot out, hitting him directly in the face. He screamed and buried his face in his hands as he stumbled backwards. I started to feel tears in my eyes as well, but I took that moment to run, and my feet pounded against the pavement as I raced back to my apartment. I locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I technically was safe now, but I just couldn't shake the fear that was beginning to creep over me. I knew that I couldn't let the homeless man's insults and threats get to me, but it was hard to ignore the fear that was beginning to gnaw at me, the fear that he would come back and try to hurt me again. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, just sort of staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man was just outside, waiting for me. Now, I knew that I should have called the cops right then and there, but I've had issues in the past, and unless you're essentially being cooked alive, the cops' response time is just essentially next to never around here. Eventually, days turned into weeks, and I started to feel more confident in my life. I started to walk home alone again, and I didn't see that guy anywhere. I thought that maybe he had moved to another area, and that maybe I was safe now, but I was wrong. One night, as I was walking home from work, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was again, his eyes seemingly blazing with anger, and it was like that entire night was playing over again in my mind, and it was clear that he'd not moved on from it at all. "You think you can get away from me?" he yelled, and he started to lunge towards me. I let out a scream, reaching for my pepper spray, but it wasn't there, and I suddenly remembered setting it on the kitchen counter and forgetting to grab it before I went out for the day. I turned to run, but he was too fast. He grabbed me, his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, fighting against him, but he was too strong and his grip was unrelenting. I was screaming, punching, kicking, anything to get the man to let me go, but nothing was working. And just when I was starting to lose hope of escaping unharmed, I see a police car pull up and 2 officers jump out, rushing towards us. The homeless man released me, and I stumbled backwards as my knees buckled underneath me. The officers were able to apprehend him, taking him into custody, and I was finally safe. I sobbed as the officer told me that I would have to make a formal statement, and after that night, I never walked home alone again. I was too traumatized by what had happened. I never forgot that fear, and it stayed with me, a sort of constant reminder of what could happen when you aren't cautious enough of your surroundings or really the area that you're living in. Sometimes it's just not safe enough to walk home on your own, and there's nothing you can really do about it. The man was charged, but received no jail time. I guess the jails in my area were already overpopulated, and his charge wasn't a serious one, so they informed me that they had to let him free. It didn't make me feel any safer, though. Hopefully I'm the last person he ever does that to, and no one else has to feel the same fear at the hands of that man. Just a reminder, if you can't get enough of the Chilling app, the horror narration app made by horror fans for horror fans, then be sure to head over to their page over on Republic, where they're not just crowdfunding their future, but looking for investors just like you to hold stock in their growing company. There's only 4 days left to invest, so be sure to click the link in the description below and get involved from the ground up. The story I'm about to tell you took place when I was only 15 years old, about 10 years ago. Now, for some context, I was raised by a single mother who worked so much that she really didn't have the time to be concerned about where I was or how long I was out. She always told me to just stay safe, and that was it. Maybe she should have cared more, though, because what happened to me a decade ago was probably the most dangerous and exciting thing that ever happened in my life, but it's still something I wish that I had never gotten myself involved in at all. I was walking home from school just like every other day, excited to play a new video game my mom had just gotten me the day before my birthday, when a strange man approached me. I distinctly remember thinking that he looked like some kind of gangbanger with his shorts sagging super low and his white wife-beater tank top soaking with his sweat. He walked beside me and asked me if I wanted to make some money. I was kind of taken aback and confused and asked what he was talking about. He then proceeded to offer me a large sum of money to deliver a package to a certain address. I think the actual amount of money was something like $200, but to a 15-year-old kid, that did sound like a lot of money to me. And the address was in a pretty sketchy part of town, and I was hesitant, but after hearing all the money, it was just too tempting. I stopped to think for a second, but I eventually accepted this guy's offer. I thought that it would be an easy way to make some cash, especially from a stranger. It took me around 45 minutes, but I eventually arrived at the address and had really begun to regret my decision to go through with it. It was some dilapidated house with broken windows and graffiti littering the outer walls. I was nervous as I approached the door, but I continued to remind myself of the money and did my best to push aside the fear welling up inside me. I knocked on the door as lightly as possible, hoping no one would even hear it and I could just leave the package on the front porch, but no luck. I was greeted by a big burly man with a stern expression on his face. He took the package from me and motioned for me to follow him inside. Everything in my body was telling me not to go inside, but I also felt like something bad would happen if I didn't, like I had no choice. So against any better judgment I may have had, I followed the man inside. Now, the inside of the house was even more disgusting than the outside. There were several shady-looking men hanging out on the sofa, and I felt like I had walked into a den of thieves like in one of my video games. The man led me to a room and opened the package in front of me. To my horror, it was filled with cash and drugs and other drug paraphernalia. I should have expected it, though, for where I was. The man turned to me and didn't ask, but instead told me, "You're going to deliver more packages like this." I was paralyzed with fear. I asked him what would happen if I said no, and all he said was that I could say no and find out. It sounded scary enough to me. I was worried about the possible consequences of me denying his request, so I just agreed. And from that day on, I'd stumbled into a world of drugs and violence, and I was already in way over my head. I tried to tell him I wanted no part in whatever he was doing and that I could find someone else to do it. I had plenty of low-life friends who wouldn't think twice about something like that, but the man didn't want anyone else knowing what they were doing. Something about how one random kid knowing was already too many. The man handed me a duffel bag full of similar-sized packages as the one I'd given him. I was given a list of addresses and told to deliver the packages to each one, and when I was done, I could come back and get paid. I was terrified, but I really felt like I had no choice. I felt like if I didn't follow their instructions, they would possibly hurt me and maybe even my family. I went from house to house, delivering packages, and I did my best to try to stay out of trouble. I didn't want to be caught carrying what I had in that bag. And days turned into weeks, and I found myself getting more and more involved in what I was doing and who I was doing it for. I delivered packages every day after school and spent most weekends doing the same. More than anything, I just wanted to be done with it. I wanted to wake up in my bed and have all of it be some awful nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was my life, and I had to deal with it. I was scared and alone with no one to turn to. I just wanted to tell my mom, but she already worked 4 jobs just to provide for us, and I didn't want to burden her with anything else, and I felt helpless. One day, around 2 months in, I was delivering a package to a particularly rough part of town when I was stopped by the police. They said that they'd gotten a tip that I may be selling drugs, so they searched my bag, and, of course, that's what they found. Drugs and cash. I was immediately arrested, taken to jail, where I faced serious charges and even jail time at my young age. I told the detectives and my mother everything. They even went to the house that I delivered the original package to and had found some druggies there, but nothing like the drug den I'd described. My mom eventually got in touch with a lawyer who specialized in these kinds of cases. I guess it wasn't uncommon for teenage boys to get caught up in stuff like that. He helped me turn over evidence to the police that proved that I'd only done these things I did because I felt like my life and the lives of my loved ones were in danger. With his help, I was able to make a deal to turn over every address I had delivered packages to, and in return, I was able to get a reduced sentence and avoid the possibility of jail time. All in all, I spent around 6 months in juvie, and it was one of the worst experiences of my life. I had a record by the end of it all, and in the span of less than a year, I went from a kid who never got in trouble to one who had been arrested for dealing and delivering illegal narcotics. My mom was disappointed in me, but years passed and she learned to forgive me, and looking back, I realized that it was my own foolishness that got me into that mess. I should have never accepted that offer to deliver the package, and no amount of money should have tempted me enough to do something so stupid. The experience changed me forever. I never forgot about the fear and danger that I faced, and I never took my freedom for granted again. I was grateful for the second chance that I was given, and I worked hard to turn my life around. I made a vow to never get involved in any illegal activities again, and I also made a promise to myself to never be so easily tempted by money again. A part of me doesn't blame myself, though. After all, I really was just some stupid kid. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. I don't know what it is about the cold night air that I love so much. Maybe it's because it's the only thing that seems to soothe me. I was only 8 years old when my mom began abusing my dad. I know a lot of people will say that he should have just stood up to her and that he's a man and he could have defended himself. But truth be told, he was so in love with my mother, even in her drunken state, that he would rather let her beat him than ever lay a hand on her. Every time my mom got in that altered state, my dad would tell me to go take a walk. It was usually at night, and I began to like the quiet, the darkness, and it became my safe place. It was almost like it was the only time I could feel safe and alone, you know? Like no one could ever hurt me. I think about how, for most people, night and darkness has the opposite effect. Most people feel vulnerable and scared, but not me. And that was until one night, and one woman, who stole that from me forever. I was 17 and my mom had just passed away. My dad took it really hard. He may have been in a physically and emotionally abusive relationship with her for 20 years, but there was nothing she could do that would ever make him stop loving her. She never laid a hand on me, so that was never something my dad had to deal with. We had just had her funeral the week before this incident, and as much as I wish I could say her death made me sad, it just didn't. I felt such intense, extreme relief. Not so much for me, but for my dad. Even if he couldn't see the damage and heartbreak she caused him, I could, and I was glad that it was over. It was a Wednesday night, and I was taking a walk around our neighborhood. I needed some time to think. Time to try and rid myself of the guilt of being glad my own mother had died. But the guilt stayed. No matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, it was there, and something in me finally realized that there was no changing that. I had walked probably somewhere along the line of 10 miles. I'd been out for hours and it was getting pretty late. Or early, it just depends on how you look at it. It was around 3 in the morning and I was pretty tired by that point. The 10 miles that I'd walked was mostly in a circle around my house, given it was a pretty large circle, but I was grateful that I was only about a mile from home. If I walked fast, I could get back in around 25 minutes. Of course, we didn't live in the safest of neighborhoods. We were on the poorer side, but we managed the best we could. I was walking around for 10 minutes when I passed by the abandoned Mexican restaurant on the corner of the road. It had closed around 10 years prior due to not being up to code, and the plants had grown around it. Most of the windows were broken in, and there was a rumor that a bunch of squatters lived inside, but I never saw any, and it didn't matter to me either way. I was just going to mind my own business, and if there were people in there and I ever saw them, I just looked the other way anyways. Well, looking the other way didn't exactly work, you see. As I walked, I watched as a woman crawled out of one of the windows of the restaurant. I have no issue telling it like it is when it comes to her because of what she did to me, and she looked absolutely disgusting. Her face and clothes were covered in dirt and muck, and even though I was only 20 feet away, I swear that I was able to smell her stench from where I was standing. She smelled like she'd been wandering through the city's sewage tunnels all night. But I looked the other way and continued walking. Around 5 minutes later, I smelled that stench again. Only this time I could tell that it was much closer. I immediately turned around, and there she was, standing directly behind me, so close that I began to gag. I don't think she appreciated that very much as she pulled out a knife and pressed it to my stomach. The gagging that had been uncontrollable until then suddenly stopped, and I felt the tip of the knife pierce my skin. I looked down at the knife and my mind went blank. My life had sucked until then, but I didn't want to die. I looked up into her eyes and just found nothing. No sympathy, no remorse for what she was doing. There was nothing there. I did notice, however, that her face was covered in sores and wounds. She didn't speak, and her face twitched, and she moved in a way that made it obvious that she was on some kind of drug, or maybe many drugs. She kept the knife pressed to my stomach as I asked her what she wanted, and again she said nothing. She used her other hand to pat my jean pockets and felt my wallet. She grabbed it and pulled it out, putting it in her own pocket. Then she pointed at the watch that I was wearing, and I took it off and handed it to her. Funny thing is that my wallet had no credit cards and no money, and my watch was worth maybe $10 at the most, but I wasn't going to tell her that. I thought since she had everything she wanted that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. It was only going to get worse from there. She forced me to walk behind the building and began to touch me in ways that I didn't want to be touched. I tried to resist, but every time I did, she pressed the knife further into my skin until I finally gave up. I laid there as I let her do whatever she wanted to me, and when she was done, she got up, took the knife away from my stomach, and walked away, like it was nothing. Like what she did to me wasn't something that would ruin me for the rest of my life. In the days that followed, I barely left my room. I cried myself to sleep every night and didn't even know if I wanted to live anymore. I didn't want to tell anyone because I knew that they wouldn't believe me. I heard about it all the time. A man saying that he had been victimized by a woman, and people would laugh and ask why he didn't just fight back or not believe him at all. I didn't want that to happen to me. I didn't want to seem weak, and I just kept everything in. I lost all relationships with friends and family. I just stopped talking altogether for some time, and I wanted nothing more than to just tell someone about what happened, but I couldn't think of anyone to tell that would listen to me and not judge me. When I was 25 and alone, I met an amazing woman named Kate. She made me feel like I wasn't on my own anymore, like there was finally a person in my life I could tell anything to, and she would listen and be there for me without any judgment at all. We were together 2 years before I told her what happened to me. She listened and said nothing as I spoke. When I was finished telling her what happened, I was a mess. I was sobbing and in the most vulnerable state of my life, and she just held me and told me no matter what that she was there for me. For the next month, we talked about it only when I wanted to and discussed my options for getting help. In the beginning, I wasn't sure about going to the police, but she helped me realize that in doing so, I could probably save other people from my fate. I filed a report, but I didn't have hope. I mostly did it for myself as a form of getting some closure. I had to be sure that it wasn't going to control my life anymore. And over the 2 years following the police report, I rekindled my relationship with my father, who was overjoyed to hear from me. Unfortunately, they never found the people living inside that Mexican restaurant or that woman. I didn't have my hopes up, but of course a part of me wanted her to pay for the damage that she'd done to me. It was 3 years ago when Kate and I got married. We have a 2-year-old daughter now, and life honestly couldn't be better. I don't think about what happened much anymore, but I felt this story was something that I needed to tell. I need other men to know that if you've been through the same thing or something similar, you're not alone, and even though I'm just one man, one person, I believe you. Before I begin telling you about the most horrific and brutal nights of my life, I'll begin by saying I am a writer, so the words I use and the detail I add may sound strange or almost like fiction, but I can't really help it at this point. It's the way my brain works whenever I'm writing a story, fiction, or in this case, a true event from my own life. I was only 20 years old, excited for life and what it would offer me. I was lucky enough that my parents had agreed to pay for my apartment in the city that I was attending university nearby. I had gotten a part-time job at a gym close by, cleaning the equipment. I was always excited for every day because a new day meant that I was closer and closer to the life I had always dreamed of. This particular day was no different. The sun was setting as I made my way down the desolate streets, my feet aching from a long day of standing on my feet, and I had decided to take a different route home, wanting to break the monotony of my daily routine. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a path of terror, fear, and sheer savagery. As I walked down the quiet street, still quite a ways away from my house, I heard a low growl, like something was waiting for me in the shadows. I looked around, searching for the source of the sound, but I saw nothing. I hesitated for a bit, wondering if I should go back and walk my usual path, but I decided against it and continued on my way. To my own disappointment, the growls persisted. They were following my every step of the way, never getting quieter or louder. I could feel the hairs on my back of my neck standing on end as a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My breath was getting caught in my throat, and I knew something or someone was following me. As I reached a dirt road, the growls grew louder and more sinister, and I realized that something really was following me. I had no other options and could think of nothing else to do, so I just broke out into a sprint. My feet slammed against the pavement as I ran for my life. I didn't dare to look back, but I could hear the growls getting closer and closer. I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. And then, I heard multiple growls, much louder and more menacing than before. I turned my head, and I saw a pack of stray dogs, their teeth bared and their feet carrying them faster than mine ever could. They had caught up to me and were now chasing me down the street. I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty streets as I ran faster and my legs getting tired from the strain. It was almost as though I could feel them already at my feet. The dogs were near, the growls now a constant sound in my ears. I couldn't keep this pace up for much longer. My legs were getting weak and I was starting to slow down. I made my way into a neighborhood when my legs finally just gave out, and that's when the dogs took their chance. They jumped on me, biting and gnawing at my flesh. First my legs and then the rest of my body as I fell to the ground in front of them. I screamed in pain, my voice a mixture of terror and agony. I tried to fight them off, but there were too many of them. I kicked and punched and did everything I could to keep them away, trying to keep them from mangling my body, but I was helpless and totally and completely at the mercy of these wild animals. Just as I thought I was going to black out and those dogs were going to eat me alive, I heard a voice shouting. A man came running out of his house just down the block from where I was laying, waving his arms and shouting at the dogs. They backed off and ran away, and the man helped me up. He told me his name was Jim and that he'd get me to the hospital as quickly as possible. As Jim helped me up, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I was going to make it out of this alive after all. But just as I started to stand, there was another growl. My heart dropped as I turned to see the pack of dogs. Their demeanor, something I can only describe as demonic. Jim tried to protect me. He stepped in front of me and started shouting and swinging at the dogs, but this time, they were relentless. They had tasted blood and they wanted more. They circled around us, growling and snarling, their teeth bared, and I could feel my own terror growing as I realized that this was it. This had to be the end. Jim fought bravely. He swung at the dogs with his arms, trying to keep them away from me, but it was no use. There were too many, and they were just too strong. I watched in horror as they jumped on him, tearing at his skin with their teeth. He screamed, a sound that will haunt me forever. I was paralyzed with fear and I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream, and I just watched as the dogs savaged Jim, his body writhing in pain as they tore him apart. I was next, and I knew it. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. I was preparing myself for what was to come once they were done with Jim when I heard the sound of one of the dogs crying in pain. I opened my eyes and I saw a woman holding a baseball bat, swinging at the dogs like her life depended on it. She stood over us, bat in hand, as she called for an ambulance. Jim and I were both taken to the hospital where he headed into emergency surgery. I felt extreme guilt in those days recovering in the hospital. Jim had only gone outside and faced those dogs to save my life, and he still ended up worse off than I did. As it turns out, the brave woman who had come to both of our rescue was actually Jim's wife, Dove. And before Jim had run out to save me, she had begged him to wait for the police, but he was intent on helping me survive this vicious attack. When she noticed that Jim and I were both in imminent danger, she grabbed their son's baseball bat and did what needed to be done. Jim and Dove are heroes. Both of them are my saviors. I'll never forget the sacrifice Jim made for me that night. He did survive, but he needed multiple skin grafts and has had many cosmetic surgeries over the years. We both kept in touch and have become great friends, and I'll always be grateful to Jim and Dove for saving my life that night. The night that changed my life forever. The world can be a dangerous place, and even the most innocent creatures that you never think about can turn on you in an instant. I was walking home from a late-night shift at the bar where I used to work. It was a cool autumn night and the city was quiet. Well, as quiet as a city could be. There was the occasional sound of leaves crunching under my feet and horns honking in the distance. I was kind of lost in thought, thinking about how I was going to make ends meet and survive in a world that only seemed to be working against me, when I heard the sounds of heels clicking against the pavement behind me. I sort of instinctively turned around and saw a woman walking towards me. I tried not to think much of it and continued on my way. I was a relatively large and strong individual, and I knew that I could handle my own if I needed to. As I walked, the woman continued to follow me, staying at about a block behind. I started to feel uneasy and picked up my pace, but she matched it, and I decided to take a different route to try to lose her, but she seemed to know exactly where I was going and continued to follow me. I looked back and saw her face in the shadows. It was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were dark and sort of void of any emotion. The more I looked at her, the more of a threat she became in my mind. I couldn't help it, but I started to feel this paranoia and began running down the street. It was like my feet moved before my brain had even told them to do so. The woman ran after me, and before I knew it, she was only a few feet behind me. Given, I wasn't exactly the quickest runner, but I really felt like I would have been able to outrun her if need be. But I was scared, and I ran down an alleyway hoping to lose her, but she was still there when I emerged on the other side. I looked back and saw her smile, this wide grin that sort of just gave me goosebumps. I continued running, not knowing where I was going, but I was trying to get away from her. I stumbled into a small park and hid behind a tree and tried to catch my breath. I heard the sound of her heels clicking on the concrete creeping up behind me until she was right beside me. I looked up at her and examined her eyes once again. They were deep and black like before, like pools of darkness that felt like they were looking right through me. She reached out and touched my face, her fingers this sort of ice coldness against my skin, and I felt paralyzed, unable to move any part of my body as she leaned in and whispered in my ear, "You can't run from me. I'll always be here." And with that, she was gone. I looked around for her, but there was no trace of anyone having entered the park recently besides myself. I was alone, but there was no part of me that felt safe. I just knew that she was still out there, watching me, and I could feel it. It felt as real as the feeling of hugging your mom on Christmas morning. It had to be real. I got up off the ground I found myself sitting on and started walking again, trying to get as far away from that park as possible. I walked for what felt like hours until I finally saw my apartment building in the distance. I ran inside and locked the door behind me, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. I wasn't tired from the walking. I was just mentally exhausted from the experience. All that mattered was that I was safe, for the moment. But I knew that she was still out there, waiting for me. The next few days were sort of a blur. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I didn't want to leave my apartment, but I had to go to work eventually. I was running out of vacation days. I was a complete mess, and I tried to hide it from my coworkers as best I could. One night after work, I was walking home, and of course, I saw her again. Only she was standing across the street this time, just watching me. My legs did that thing again, and I started to run, but she was there every time I turned a corner. She was there every time I turned around. I was trapped, and I felt like there was no way to escape her. And then, just like the last time, she was gone. I was relieved, but I knew it was only a matter of time before she returned. I couldn't take it anymore. I was scared and I didn't know what else to do, so I went to the police, but of course they didn't believe me. They laughed and told me that I was just imagining things and that I needed to see a doctor. I knew they were wrong, but I didn't know how to prove it. Days went by without seeing the mysterious and creepy black-eyed woman. Then days turned into weeks, and I thought that maybe she was gone for good. One night I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a soft knocking at my door. I got out of bed and my heart was racing. I slowly approached the door. I didn't know for sure who it could be, but I had a feeling that it was her. I looked through the peephole and I saw her standing there, her pale face barely illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. I felt frozen, unable to move. She continued to knock, softly at first and then more urgently. I was scared, but for some reason felt compelled to open the door. Finally, after mustering up the courage I could find, I opened the door and she was standing there, just as I remembered, with those dark, cold eyes. She smiled at me, that same wide grin, and stepped inside my apartment. I tried to run, but she was too quick. She appeared in front of me again, and I struggled to find the will to escape her. I stood as still as a statue as she leaned in and whispered in my ear. "You can't escape me," she said. "I am your destiny." And again, she just disappeared. I was alone in my apartment, but I could feel her presence all around me. I knew that she was watching me. I wanted to scream, to tell her to come back and tell everyone what she had been doing to me the past few months. For days, I didn't see her again, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I was scared to leave my apartment, and I was scared to stay inside. A week later, I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed, watching me, a dark smile on her face. I screamed as loud as I could. I was completely unable to move. It was like she had this power over me. I knew that I needed help, so I decided to see a therapist, and I explained to her about the woman who had been stalking me and how I felt like she was always there, watching me. How it all started when I was walking home alone that one night. The therapist listened to me and then recommended that I see a psychologist for a more in-depth evaluation. And after several appointments and tests, the psychologist diagnosed me with schizophrenia. He told me that the woman I'd been seeing and the feelings of being watched were a part of my illness. The feeling that I was being touched by her was what was called a tactile hallucination, and it's when you feel something that isn't there and only exists in your mind. I guess there was a history of it in my family, this mental illness, and they said that it sometimes can be precipitated based on the usage of hallucinogenic drugs, which I did participate in from time to time. I just never expected to have this kind of effect on my mind. I was devastated, and I didn't want to believe that what I had experienced wasn't real. But over time I came to accept my diagnosis and started taking my medication as prescribed. I thought that I had put that experience behind me and was finally able to move on with my life. However, there were still times when I felt like she was watching me and I would begin to get scared all over again. But then one day, I was walking down the street alone again and I saw her. She was standing across the road, staring at me like she had done so many times before. I felt like I was going to faint and stumble backwards, and of course when I looked back, she wasn't there. I immediately called my therapist and went to see them. They reassured me that it was just a symptom of my illness and that I was safe. They told me to continue taking my medication, and over time, I was able to overcome my fears. I've learned to manage my illness, and I live a fulfilling life to the best of my abilities. But even now, there are still times when I feel like she's watching me. Times when I see her and even other hallucinations my mind has thought up. I still have some auditory and visual hallucinations. My symptoms are never 100% gone, but I try not to do things that trigger them. I just hope that my story will help others who are going through other mental health situations. And it's important to know that you're not alone and that there is help out there. Hey friends, thanks for listening. click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are some super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday nights. You should join. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit or my email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.